Few crimes offend our sense of justice as much as the killing of an innocent child. The very fact that some ancient societies ever practiced the ritual murder of their own offspring is almost impossible for the modern mind to grasp. Of all the moral topics on which everyone can agree, this is surely at the top of the list. Our religious literature, however, records a violent past in which child sacrifice was a regrettable reality. Even the Bible contains both obvious and subtle references to the practice, but it is a topic that few believers ever dwell on. In the Christian West, the Bible is often upheld as a moral lodestone, with the implicit understanding that horrors like slavery and human sacrifice were never, ever condoned by God, even if such practices existed at the time. And yet, we find verses like this one in Ezekiel, which implies something much more sinister.
I gave the Israelites statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not live. I defiled them through their very gifts, in their offering up all their firstborn, in order that I might horrify them, so that they might know that I am Yahweh.
To get the full story on child sacrifice in the Bible, we must turn to the Bible's scholars, archaeologists, and historians who dedicate their lives to understanding ancient Israel. In this documentary, we take an unflinching look at the hard questions. Who were the people sacrificing children? And why would they do such a thing? What god or gods were children sacrificed to? What does the Mosaic Law say about child sacrifice? How should we interpret the stories of Israelite heroes like Abraham and Jephthah that have strong undertones of child sacrifice? And lastly, how has the theme of child sacrifice influenced the development of Christianity? Our main guide on this quest will be the excellent book, King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, Biblical Distortions of Historical Realities by Old Testament scholar Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou. Dr. Stavrakopoulou teaches at the University of Exeter and is a leading authority in the field of modern biblical studies. We'll also occasionally refer to other books and papers as needed for clarification or alternative viewpoints. In the meantime, consider this: if every word of the Bible is inerrant, it is divine or inspired by God, and in this Bible you find God permitting, sometimes even demanding, the sacrifice of a human, what does this tell you about the nature, the character, the morality of this deity? For me, it raises questions about the morality of the authors of the text. But also, what does it say about modern preachers who want to demand that our morality needs to be derived from the Word of God, when this God behaves in such a manner? In John Milton's Paradise Lost, the foremost demon of hell and one of the most terrifying of Satan's lieutenants is Molech, the lord of child sacrifice. A horrid king besmeared with blood of human sacrifice and parents' tears. That name has struck fear in people's hearts for millennia, and it remains a part of our collective psyche in the West to this day. This is evident in Western pop culture, with villains named Molech showing up in everything from superhero comic books to science fiction and fantasy television and video games. But who or what was Molech originally? The name Molech originates with an obscure word spelled with the Hebrew letters Mem, Lamed, and Kaf. The vowels added by the medieval Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes produced the pronunciation Molech, while the spelling Moloch comes from the Greek Septuagint and Latin Vulgate translations. This word appears in a few verses that concern child sacrifice in the Bible. In these later Bible translations, the Masoretic Hebrew, the Septuagint, and the Vulgate treat the term as though it was a proper name or title of a god. Thus, for a long time, Bible scholars and historians assumed that the ancient Canaanites had sacrificed their children to an evil god named Molech. A typical example of these Molech verses is Leviticus 18:21, which states,
"You shall not give any of your offspring to pass them over to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh."
In each of the Molech passages, one's offspring is described as being passed over or given to the Molech. So far, so good, right? The evil Canaanite god Molech demanded child sacrifice, but the benevolent Israelite god Yahweh prohibited it. We may be reassured that the Bible preaches a morality that was far superior to that of Israel's wicked neighbors, or so people used to think. Almost a century ago, German theologian Otto Eisfeld published a book claiming that there never was any deity called Molech. Instead, Eisfeld argued that to the Molech actually meant as a Molech sacrifice, and he based his claim on new archaeological evidence for child sacrifices that had been discovered at ancient Phoenician colonies around the Mediterranean. Now, the accusation of child sacrifice had been made against the Phoenicians since ancient times. We find lurid descriptions of their sacrifice rituals in the writings of Diodorus Siculus, a historian from the 1st century BCE, and in the writings of Philo of Byblos, among others. What the new archaeological evidence showed, though, was that the inscriptions at these Phoenician sites referred to the child sacrifices as Moloch sacrifices, and that they were performed in fulfillment of a vow by the child's parents. Some inscriptions even used the identical phrase "to the Moloch" that we find in the Bible. Although the meaning of the word Moloch was unclear and is still debated to today, it was obvious to Eisfeld and others that Molech, or Moloch, was not in fact the name of a god, but a category of sacrifice ritual associated with vows. At the Phoenician sites, it was usually the goddess Tanit, or her consort Baal-Hamon, who was the recipient of the sacrifice, and the parents would receive some kind of blessing in return. One inscription found at a ritual site reads,
"Presented to the Lord Baal-Hamon is the vow that Idnibal, son of Abdeshmun, vowed, the Moloch sacrifice of a person of his own flesh. He heard his voice, and he blessed him."
It's important to remember that Phoenicians and Israelites were two ethnic subgroups descended from the same West Semitic culture. They lived next to each other, spoke similar language dialects, and had similar religious practice. Thus, the strong argument can be made that the Bible verses in question are criticizing not sacrifices to a foreign god, but sacrifices of the Moloch category. Now, there is no point in making laws prohibiting people from doing something they have no history of doing or interest in doing. From the Molech verses alone, it is clear that some Israelites were indeed sacrificing their children through this ancient ritual. But to which god were they sacrificing their children? That should be obvious now, when we take a new look at the same Leviticus 18:21.
"You shall not give any of your offspring to pass them over to the Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh."
Why would the name of Yahweh be profaned by this ritual. Sacrifices carried out in honor of Baal, or Dagon, or any other Canaanite god would not have that effect. The answer can only be that the Israelites were performing child sacrifices in Yahweh's name, with Yahweh as the recipient. There's a second group of passages in the Pentateuch that command the Israelites to give their firstborn to Yahweh. And from the language used, it is clear that sacrifices are intended. One of these passages is Exodus 22, verses 28 and 29.
You shall not delay to make offerings from your fullness of the grape harvest and from your outflow of the presses. The firstborn of your sons you will give to me, just as you will do with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days he or it shall remain with his or its mother. On the 8th day you shall give he or it to me.
As Stavrakopoulou points out, human firstborn are distinguished from animal firstborn here, but not differentiated. As the text plainly reads, the same sacrificial outcome applies to both. In contrast, Exodus 13:13 and Exodus 34:20 command similar sacrifices, but require the human child to be redeemed or rescued. However, Stavrakopoulou notes there is no textual reason to assume that the same principle applies to Exodus 22. We are dealing with different sets of laws that were edited over time by different authors, and that remain inconsistent on the rules regarding the sacrifice of firstborn human children. The inconsistency increases the closer you look. Exodus 13:13 and Exodus 34:20 also allow for donkey firstborn to be redeemed with a sheep, but they do not explain how the human firstborn are redeemed. The solution to that oversight is not given until Numbers 18, where the Aaronide priests are told that human children must be redeemed with money. Because of these and similar problems, Stavrakopoulou states, citing a similar observation by John Levinson, that it is attractive to view the redemption clauses as secondary expansions of the sacrificial laws. However, because the editorial history and the interrelation of the Pentateuchal laws are so complex, we have to turn to other passages for confirmation that human children were, in fact, targeted by the original laws about firstborn sacrifices. An important passage here is the one we quoted earlier from Ezekiel. The context is a passage in which the prophet Ezekiel, speaking on behalf of Yahweh, describes how the Israelites had to be punished for their wickedness after they were brought up out of Egypt.
I gave the Israelites statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not live. I defiled them through their very gifts, in their offering up all their firstborn, in order that I might horrify them, so that they might know that I am Yahweh.
It is clear that the Hebrew vocabulary used here, particularly the phrase passing over, is distinctive language referring to sacrifice. And according to Stavrakopoulou, it
leaves little room for doubt that Yahweh was believed to have legislated for child sacrifice.
This remarkable statement by Ezekiel would have little force if the firstborn sacrifice laws known to Ezekiel allowed human children to be exempted by providing money or a sacrificial animal as a substitute. No, it is clear that from Ezekiel's statement that child sacrifice had been
accepted as a ritual native to Yahweh worship, yet designed to defile and devastate its practitioners.
It is a fact that the author of Ezekiel is very unhappy about, yet unable to deny. Stavrakopoulou describes this passage as a
uniquely ethical condemnation of child sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible.
But despite his condemnation, Ezekiel is also forced to defend the ritual of child sacrifice as a horror that the Israelites deserved for their unfaithfulness. It's important to note here that Exodus in its present form is generally regarded as a post-exilic text compiled and edited by the Aaronide priesthood that controlled the Second Temple under the Persians. In other words, the sacrificial laws known to Ezekiel predated the text that we have in our own Bibles, and those older laws were quite possibly more explicit with regard to child sacrifice than the conflicting rules contained in the final version of the Pentateuch. Another example of a no-good decree made in God's name and with God's approval can be found in Joshua 6:26. This is the aftermath of the Battle of Jericho, which we are all familiar with. Joshua and the Israelites have just finished attacking the city of Jericho, looting its silver and gold, slaughtering each and every resident, including the children, and burning the city to the ground, all at God's command, of course. Then Joshua declares an oath.
Cursed before Yahweh be anyone who tries to build this city, this Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn, he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest, he shall set up its gates.
This oath is fulfilled later on in 1 Kings 16:34.
In Ahab's days, Heel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and with Segub, his youngest son, he set up its gates, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by Joshua, son of Nun.
Interestingly, the fulfillment emphasizes that this oath requiring the sacrifice of two children, a firstborn and a lastborn, came from the word of Yahweh himself and was not just a reckless curse uttered by Joshua. The fact that this sacrifice is decreed by Yahweh prevents the biblical author from criticizing it, although a few Greek manuscripts prudently omit the phrase according to the word of Yahweh. Another interesting passage that relates to child sacrifice is the oracle in Micah 6. Although the context and dating of this oracle are unclear and widely debated, it involves a dispute between Yahweh and Israel, with the speaking voice alternating between the two parties. In verse 6 and 7, Israel asks what it must do to get Yahweh to act on its behalf.
With what should I approach Yahweh and bow to the exalted God? Will I approach him with burnt offerings, with one-year-old calves? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams or with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Will I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my belly for the sin of myself?
We have here an escalating list of increasingly precious gifts that the supplicant can offer Yahweh, beginning with the sacrifice of calves and ending with the ultimate offering, the sacrifice of one's firstborn child. Now, some scholars argue that the passage is satirical hyperbole, and that the final offer of one's firstborn should not be taken literally. However, Stavrakopoulou argues that these verses are
best understood as a series of legitimate and increasingly valuable offerings which are ultimately fruitless for the present purpose of the poet, that is, in seeking to atone for sin.
It's important to note that Yahweh rejects all the sacrifices equally at the end of the oracle: the animal sacrifices, the oil, and the firstborn. We know without question that other biblical laws demanded offerings of animals and oil, and there is nothing in Micah 6 that distinguishes them from the firstborn sacrifice. As Old Testament scholar Heath Durrell at the University of Texas at Austin explains in his book on child sacrifice in the Bible,
There is no indication in the text of Micah 6:1-8 that firstborn sacrifice was understood as qualitatively different from the sacrifice of calves, rams, or oil. Indeed, the logic of the oracle seems to proceed from sacrifices that would have been perceived as acceptable, burnt offerings and calves, to those that would have been viewed as even more effective, thousands of rams and myriads of oil, finally culminating in the most precious of all possible sacrifices, the offering of a firstborn child. The sacrifice of one's firstborn child is depicted as extraordinary, but there is no indication that the oracle is presenting the sacrifice as in any way intrinsically unsuitable. Thus, the context of the oracle implies that all of the offerings are extremely valuable and, at least in theory, acceptable, even if current circumstances had caused Yahweh to reject all sacrifices as ineffective.
Stavrakopoulou uses the term
foundation myths
for the two key stories of the Bible that shape the history of Israel and define Israel in terms of her role as Yahweh's chosen people. These are the ancestor myth, which concerns Abraham and his descendants in the Promised Land, and the Exodus myth, which describes Israel as a nation that came out of Egypt.
It is striking,
says Stavrakopoulou, that a prominent motif in both of these myths is
the role of Yahweh as child slayer.
To see what she means by that, let's take a look at the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, an episode often called the Akedah. Most viewers are undoubtedly familiar with the story. Once upon a time, after Abraham's wife Sarah has given birth to her firstborn Isaac, God calls to Abraham and tells him to sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering on a mountain. Abraham and Isaac set out and reached the location specified by God after several days. Abraham builds an altar and lays down the wood for the sacrifice. He is just about to plunge the knife into his son when the angel of Yahweh calls down from heaven to stay his hand. Abraham then spies a ram caught in a thicket nearby and sacrifices it in place of his son. It is clear, however we interpret the story, that the motif of child sacrifice has a central role in it. Stavrakopoulou draws particular attention to verses 16 through 18, in which God expresses his approval of Abraham's obedience.
Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice.
Stavrakopoulou remarks,
it is within the explicit context of child sacrifice that Yahweh blesses Abraham, the father of the biblical Israel and paradigmatic alien in a foreign land, promising to make his descendants a great nation.
Although some scholars try to interpret the Akedah as a polemic against child sacrifice, whose purpose is to legitimate the sacrificial laws that allow a substitute to take the place of a human child, Stavrakopoulou and Levinson strongly disagree. After all, says Stavrakopoulou,
none of the sacrifice texts specifying substitution for the firstborn child mention Abraham nor allude to the Akedah.
Levinson remarks,
Genesis 22, 1-19 is frighteningly unequivocal about Yahweh's ordering of a father to offer up his son as a sacrifice. It is passing strange to condemn child sacrifice through a narrative in which a father is richly rewarded for his willingness to carry out that very practice.
Even though the focus of the story is Abraham's faithfulness toward Yahweh, his willingness to sacrifice his own child is an essential element of the story, the very thing that demonstrates his faithfulness. Furthermore, a more general tradition of sacrificing one's firstborn son may underlie the story. Stavrakopoulou ties the Akedah too, the immense importance that the sacrificial laws of Exodus and Numbers place on the status of the firstborn as Yahweh's portion, with firstborn being defined in relation to the mother as the one who opens the womb. Thus, Isaac is the firstborn of Sarah, the most valuable child of Abraham's household, even if Ishmael was born first. The ancient importance of the firstborn in Israel and similar societies is bound up with the concept of fertility, which is why the sacrificial laws emphasize that the firstborn is the first child that opens the womb of the mother rather than the father's heir. A related term with essentially the same meaning is only begotten. In his book on child sacrifice, Heath Durrell takes on several practical objections to the notion that Israelite society could have accommodated the sacrifice of every firstborn. Responding to the claim that such sacrifices would have a devastating effect on the population, Durrell cites a study showing that ancient societies had significantly higher fertility rates and infant mortality rates than modern Western societies. Firstborn children would have comprised between a quarter and 1/7 of the children born to an average household, and infant mortality was particularly high in the case of firstborn children, with an infant mortality rate of 50% or even higher. Thus, there is no demographic reason why such a society could not practice firstborn sacrifices. Regarding the objection that biological attachment to one's children would preclude infant sacrifice, Durrell cites several experts who explain that concepts of parenthood and attitudes toward children are closely bound up with one's own time and culture. The high mortality rate of ancient times would also have impacted the ways parents allowed themselves to become attached to their children. At any rate, none of these objections would apply any differently to Israelites than they would to other ancient Near Eastern cultures. If the Phoenicians could survive and even flourish despite the practice of child sacrifice, then so could the Israelites. Durrell also delves into the logic behind laws concerning first fruits and firstborn. Giving the first of everything to Yahweh was good, not only because it was Yahweh's due, but because it would bestow a blessing on the remainder of the crop, livestock, and in extreme cases, children. This principle is made explicit in Proverbs 3.
Honor Yahweh with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your harvest, and your silos will be full with plenty, and your vats will burst with wine.
The converse is that robbing Yahweh and enjoying the first fruits yourself would incur Yahweh's wrath, as we read in Jeremiah 2:3.
Israel was holy to Yahweh, the first fruits of his harvest. All who ate of it were guilty. Evil came upon them, an utterance of Yahweh.
In a society with infant mortality rates of 50%, ancient Israelites would have sought any available means, as Durrell puts it, of increasing the number of children who survived to adulthood. By that gruesome calculation, it would have seemed reasonable to sacrifice one child if it guaranteed more in the future. The goal of sacrificing one's firstborn child was not to avoid having children, but on the contrary, to have more of them. Durrell concludes,
If there is no real demographic impediment, and there is no reason to assume that widespread infanticide is somehow absurd on its face, then there is nothing a priori to militate against a literal understanding of the version of the law of the firstborn in Exodus 22:28b, 29. Indeed, it is possible even to argue that infant sacrifices given in response to Yahweh's claim to all firstborn children and animals actually demonstrates how children were strongly desired among the Israelites.
The story of Jephthah's daughter is yet another story involving child sacrifice, with Yahweh as the recipient. You probably know this story as well, though it is not nearly as popular in Sunday school as the binding of Isaac. In Judges 11, a notorious outlaw named Jephthah is asked to command the warriors of Gilead in their war against the Ammonites. Jephthah, a pious believer in Yahweh, swears an oath that if Yahweh gives him victory over the Ammonites in battle, then he will offer up the first person to come out of his house and meet him upon his return as a burnt offering to Yahweh. Jephthah goes on to win a decisive victory over the Ammonites, but when he returns home, it is his daughter who comes out the door to greet him. Jephthah is distraught, but cannot take back his vow to Yahweh. Jephthah's daughter agrees to be sacrificed, so long as she is first given 2 months to spend with her friends in the mountains and mourn her virginity. At the end of the 2 months, she is sacrificed by her father as promised. Some of the details in this story parallel those of the other sacrifice passages. For one thing, the narrator is keen to emphasize the daughter's important status as Jephthah's only begotten child.
She was his only child. He had no son or daughter except her.
The language regarding the burnt offering is also the same as what we read in Isaac's story. Stavrakopoulou remarks,
Given that both Jephthah and Abraham are consistently depicted as heroic figures faithful to Yahweh, it is highly significant that in neither story is the practice of child sacrifice condemned nor even remarked upon by the narrator. Rather, it is the function of the sacrifice that appears to receive the narrator's attention. Both the Akedah and the story of Jephthah's daughter present the sacrifice of a child to Yahweh as an action bringing divine blessing.
Stavrakopoulou also points out the connection with fertility, since the story emphasizes the virgin nature of the daughter and depicts her as spending 2 lunar cycles weeping over her unfulfilled potential fertility. Durrell's assessment of the Jephthah story is somewhat different, citing earlier observations by the scholars Hermann Gunkel, Walter Baumgartner, and Jack Sasson. He points out that the story of Jephthah follows a specific fairy tale structure. Stories of this kind often feature a man who promises his child to a stranger, demon, sorcerer, or some other magical creature in return for help during a crisis. The child is either his only child or his most beloved, and the child is often specified in an indirect way, such as being the first to meet him when he comes home. Typically, it is only later that the father understands the full significance of his promise. There are numerous examples of this fairy tale structure from ancient Greek literature. To give just one such example, in the story of Idonemus, as told by Servius, King Idonemus of Crete promises to sacrifice to Neptune the first thing to meet him upon his return home if he survives a storm at sea. That first thing to meet him turns out to be his son. According to Servius, some versions of the tale end with Idonemus carrying out the sacrifice, while in others he does not. The Greek stories of Meander, Haliartus, and Iphigenia are also very similar. Because of its apparent dependence on Hellenistic stories, Durrell puts less weight on the significance of the Jephthah story. Nevertheless, the story illustrates that for the Israelite authors who wrote and preserved this folktale, the sacrifice of one's firstborn in fulfillment of an ambiguous vow was at least conceptually and theoretically possible. After assessing all the biblical and extra-biblical evidence, Stavrakopoulou proposes that 3 different child sacrifice cults were likely practiced in ancient Israel. The first was the practice of firstborn sacrifices. Although it must remain speculative, without archaeological corroboration, it seems likely that parents in some situations would sacrifice their firstborn children to Yahweh in the hopes that they would be blessed with further children. Stavrakopoulou writes,
In religious terms, a large family was essential for a peaceful afterlife. Within the perpetual cycle of life and death, the living administered cultically to their dead ancestors to secure their blessings upon the family and to pave the way for their own inevitable role as one of the ancestors.
The second type of sacrifice was the practice of Moloch sacrifices. Based on the association of these sacrifices with King Ahaz and Manasseh, and the fact that the Semitic stem mem, lamed, kaf can mean royal, Stavrakopoulou believes this sacrifice was a royal sacrifice offered by the king within the royal Yahweh cult at Jerusalem. It was a fertility ritual carried out to ensure the perpetuation of the royal dynasty. It is an interesting fact the messianic term sprout that is often used to describe the heirs of the Davidic monarchy in the Bible also appears in Phoenician inscriptions related to child sacrifice. This ideology may be embedded in the very name of David himself, which means beloved, according to a myth told by the Phoenician historian Sanchuniathon about the origins of child sacrifice. Kronos, who was equivalent to the Phoenician and Hebrew god El, dressed his only begotten son in royal apparel and sacrificed him on an altar. In some manuscripts, that son's name is Yedud, meaning beloved. In others, it is Yaud, meaning only begotten. The third type of child sacrifice practiced in Judah, according to Stavrakopoulou, may have been a special sacrifice made to gods called the Shaddayim. This group of gods is mentioned in the famous 8th century Balaam texts found at Deir Allah in Jordan, which according to some reconstructions of the damaged text, describe the use of child sacrifice to prevent a supernatural darkness from afflicting the land. Furthermore, in Deuteronomy 32, we read the following.
They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him. They sacrificed to the Shaddayim, not Eloah, to gods they did not know, to new ones recently arrived, whom your ancestors did not dread. You forgot the rock who begot you. You ignored El who gave you birth.
Yahweh is sometimes known as El Shaddai in the Bible, and this name is undoubtedly related to the Shaddayim in some way. However, the meaning of Shaddai and the exact relationship between the Shaddayim and ancient Judahite religion are riddles that remain unsolved. Durrell also recognizes 3 categories of child sacrifice in ancient Israel, but he differs from Stavrakopoulou on one point in particular. Like Stavrakopoulou, he recognizes the sacrifice of the firstborn as a native Israelite practice that finds support in the Bible, though it's impossible to know how widespread the actual practice of firstborn sacrifices was. Durrell also recognizes the existence of Moloch sacrifices, which he believes were incorporated into the Yahweh cult at Jerusalem at a relatively late period. Like the firstborn sacrifices, Yahweh was certainly the recipient of these sacrifices. Durrell is skeptical about Stavrakopoulou's proposal regarding the Shaddayim sacrifices, and he disagrees with her reading of the Balaam texts. Rather, his third category is that of sacrificing a firstborn child during times of urgent crises. He believes this is the type of sacrifice depicted in 2 Kings chapter 3, a fascinating story in which Moabite king Mesha sacrifices his own son on the walls of his stronghold at Kir Hareseth as a last-ditch effort to defend against the invading armies of Israel, Judah, and Edom. The sacrifice causes divine wrath, apparently from the Moabite god Chemosh, to come upon the Israelite coalition, forcing them to retreat and saving Moab in the process. Although this sacrifice is performed by a foreign king on behalf of a foreign god, the story demonstrates that in the mind of the biblical authors, such sacrifices could indeed be efficacious. Furthermore, Durrell believes that the oracle in Micah 6 that we have already discussed expresses the same belief in child sacrifices performed during times of distress, but with Israel as the supplicant and Yahweh as the recipient. We mentioned earlier that both Israelite foundation stories involved the motif of child sacrifice. The second one, of course, is the Exodus story, and in particular, the 10th plague of Egypt, in which all the firstborn of Egypt are taken by God. But the Israelite firstborn are spared through the substitute of lambs. At some point, this story becomes associated with the Passover festival. And as you may have noticed by now, the phrase passing over or handing over is the standard language used by the Hebrew Bible when speaking about sacrifices. As a whole, the 10th plague is a powerful and horrifying example of the priestly author's understanding of the firstborn sacrifice turned into a narrative. Every Egyptian firstborn dies, and every Israelite firstborn is redeemed by the blood of a lamb. According to a recent study by Polish scholar Łukasz Niszczałowski-Spano, Josiah was the first historical character in the Old Testament to perform the Passover ritual, and this festival must have been connected with him in some key way, if the story of his reforms in 2 Kings 23:21-23 is grounded in real events. Niszczałowski-Spano speculates that the Passover was Josiah's replacement for the royal Molech sacrifice ritual, and had the same function of guaranteeing God's protection and salvation for the nation, but using animal sacrifices instead of human sacrifices. It was only later, after the monarchy was long gone, that the ritual came to be associated with the Exodus. Despite the horrors of child sacrifice, the Passover and its ancient roots in the sacrifice of the royal firstborn continue to make its influence felt in Judaism and the offshoot Christ movement of the 1st century CE. Christian theology openly links Jesus' death to the Passover sacrifice as the lamb that is slaughtered to save humankind. However, the vocabulary of ancient Israelite and Phoenician firstborn child sacrifices, only begotten, beloved, and firstborn son, still dominates the language used to describe Jesus. As John Van Cedars observes in a 2003 paper,
Christians still dedicate infants to God, whether through baptism, christening, or other rites. The roots of such religious beliefs and practices are very deep and very strange.
Child sacrifice was a regrettable reality in the ancient world, and its presence in the Bible ought not to surprise us. Although we do not know exactly when, where, or how often these rituals took place, the foremost scholars who have studied this topic agree that they were an accepted part of the Yahweh religion at times. It is a practice about which the Bible's authors themselves disagreed. Some, such as those who authored the sacrificial laws of Exodus 22, apparently approved. Ezekiel apparently felt the need both to condemn such laws as horrifying and to defend them as something that Yahweh deemed necessary. Others, like Jeremiah, insisted that Yahweh had never commanded or entertained the idea. And yet, the assumption that child sacrifices can be valid and effective remains evident in stories like the Akedah, Jephthah's daughter, King Mesha's son, and the theology that permeates the Christian crucifixion story.